see. Yeah, and you can see the presentation. So no, not yet. Vale, no veurà.
Duplicate slideshow.
Si no, vale, es veu.
Vale,
això és com vale, perfecte. Okay, now there we are. So in this session, we're going to talk about plastic damage approach to consider fatigue analysis problems. And as I said, this session is going to be presented by myself, Tammy Martinez, and by Lucia Barbu. And I will give you a very brief introduction, and then we will, in this introduction, I will define you different fatigue phenomena that take place in structures, and then we will show you some applications of the formulations that we are putting in place in different European projects. So as an introduction, I have to start with the definition of what is fatigue, and according to the STM code, well, I'm pretty sure most of you already know what's fatigue, but it's cyclic load produced failure on the structural parts for values lower than those obtained statically. And here I want to make a first remark. I mean, fatigue is used for loads below the yield strength. We will see that there's some part of fatigue, and I'm going to present you some formulations for loads beyond the yield strength. Okay, but I mean, the ASTM and most of the machines and mechanisms that suffer fatigue suffer it for loads lower than the ones that produce the yield of the structure. And that's why it's quite a concern, because the structure fails before knowing it. I mean, it's a fragile fracture, and it doesn't tell you because of large deformations that it's going to happen. Now, on what depends fatigue? It depends on the material that you have. Depending on the material that you have, you will have one fatigue response or another one. And it depends on the stress and strain history applied to the material or to your component. And based on these factors, and especially if we are looking at high cycle fatigue, the most common way of working with fatigue, of analyzing fatigue, is through the Euler curves. Which are those curves? It's something like that. Any of you have already worked with fatigue. I mean, I'm pretty sure you know them. This is for a given material. If you change of material, you will have a different curve. And it tells you, depending on the amplitude of your stresses in the material, the number of cycles that you will be able to apply, which is the most interesting thing, or the thing that the engineers want to know. For how many cycles can this machine work before it fails due to fatigue? Okay, here we can see two different lines. I mean, we've got this yield strength. I mean, above this, we'll have plasticity. And we've got the endurance limit that tells us the load for which fatigue will not happen. I mean, if you apply lower loads, the fatigue phenomenon does not occur. Usually codes work with this red line. They are not concerned, they are not bothered above yield strength, because usually codes does not allow you to apply low stresses larger than the yield strength. And they define this endurance limit, and they give you a straight line. Now, with this graph, I can define you the different fatigue failure modes that can occur on a material. Okay, we've got. I have defined this orange area in which we will have what we call high cycle fatigue. It's fatigue for number of cycles above usually 10,000 cycles, and it's a damage-driven process. And it's a damage-driven process because as you are below the yield strength, plasticity factors do not have any sort of plasticity. Then we've got this blue line here, which is what it's called ultra-low cycle fatigue. Okay? It's the fatigue that you find for very few cycles, less than 100, for example. And in this case, we are above the yield strength. And then plasticity phenomena will take place. And then we've got this mixed area, which is usually considered low cycle fatigue. And it's between the ultra low cycle fatigue and the high cycle fatigue. And in this area, you can have both plasticity and phenomena and damage phenomena. I'm showing this in this graph here, okay, where you've got this ultra low cycle fatigue that is driven mainly by plasticity phenomena. You have this high cycle fatigue that is driven mainly by damage phenomena. And you've got this gray area in which these two phenomena occur. And you will have to mix both formulations if you want to simulate it properly. Okay? So, as I told you before, I mean, this presentation, we will talk first about a model that has been developed to tackle with ultra low cycle fatigue. Then we'll show you a damage model developed for high cycle fatigue, and we will show you finally a model that couples both of them. So if I go a bit fast, I mean, just let me know, but I'm just trying to get some time. So let's start with this plastic damage model. And let's start with this first slide in which I give you some basics. Again, I'm showing you previous graph, stating that ultra low cycle fatigue usually takes place for cycles or failure that it's below 100 cycles. I mean, if you want to think about the ultra low cycle fatigue, I'm pretty sure you have already used it in your normal life. If you have a wire, metal wire, and you want to break it, what you do is twist it against it itself. And usually just doing, I don't know, 10, 15 twists, it breaks. I mean, you're taking this wire to plasticity and you're repeating this plastic phenomena 10, 15 times until it breaks. I mean, that's ultra low cycle fatigue. And in this case, if we want to find something similar to the SN curve or the Euler curve, what we have is the coffin-Mason curve that replaces the stress amplitude for the plastic strain amplitude. Okay, as we are in the plasticity range, we have to look to plastic strains in order to know when this material will fail. And what the coffin-Mason curve times the number of cycles, both. Okay, so if you increase this plastic strain amplitude, what will happen is that you will reduce the amount of cycles that you can apply. Now, I'm proposing you to solve this problem. Okay, what we've done is to modify an already plastic damage model that was available, the Barcelona plastic damage model, and modify it in order to be able to take into account ultra low cycle fatigue. And how is this done? Right? This Barcelona plastic damage model, it's a model that takes into account the plastic energy that is consumed by the material during the plasticity, the evolution of the plasticity. Okay, it's a model that measures, it's capable of measuring how much plastic energy we are dissipating in the plastic phenomena. So what we're stating is that this plastic energy can tell us when the material will break due to ultra low cycle fatigue. Okay? So let's see if this works in this way. Okay. First, I'm gonna just show you very briefly the main equations of plastic model. I mean, it's plastic model. I'm sure you already know that. I mean, it's based on the additivity of the Helmholtz free energy. The total free energy contains the elastic part and the plastic part. It can be written that way. The elastic strains are the total strains minus the plastic ones, and the stresses are produced only by the elastic strains. And any plastic model needs a yield and potential functions. If the yield and potential functions are the same, we are talking about associated plasticity. Otherwise, you've got the yield function tells you you're outside this yield function, tells you that you're in the plastic range, and the potential function takes you back to that yield surface. And the yield surface can be written in this form, in which S are the stresses on the material, alpha is the term corresponding to the kinematic hardening, and kappa T is the term that corresponds to the isotropic hardening. Which are these hardenings? And they are explained here more with two different images. The kinematic plastic hardening, what it does is that it moves the yield surface, and it's responsible of what is called the Boschinger effect. And that effect allows us to have hysteresis that just fall between inside itself. Okay, if you don't have this Boschinger effect, what will happen is that a hysteresis cycle will move along the strain axis. Okay, because the plastic strains are kept constant and they will move around. And the way in which, I mean, there are different procedures or different formulations or models to take into account this kinematic plastic hardening. The one that we have implemented is the Frederick Armstrong model. And then the isotropic plastic hardening, what it does is that it moves the yield surface. So if you've got the perfect plasticity, I mean, you have your elastic branch, and then perfect plasticity just gives you a constant stress as the plastic strains increase. This surface is maintained fixed. If you have hardening, what happens with this surface is that it increases as the process increases, okay? Because each time you can apply larger stress. And if you have softening, what happens with this surface is that it just decreases, okay? Giving you less stress as the plastic strain evolves. The evolution of the isotropic plastic hardening is shown in this graph. Okay, you've got the elastic branch, and then you can have some hardening, and here you have some softening. Okay, what we've done, and the model that I'm showing you here conceptually, if you want the whole equations, I mean, you can look at the literature, and we are not getting into there now. It defines three different regions, so you can adapt this curve to your material with total freedom. Okay, you have a first region in which you do polynomial curve fitting, so you give some points, and you can fit your model to the exact performance of your material. Then you have a straight line defined by a slope, and then you have the softening. Okay, the area below this curve is the plastic energy that is available in the material. That's what will drive this ultra-low cycle fatigue. Right? If you've got a larger area, your material will be able to dissipate more energy, and then it will hold larger cycles. If you reduce this area, your material will be able to hold less. And what happens? If you do a very large cycles, so just imagine your hysteresis cycle just comes to the middle, just comes back, and then comes again to the middle. Just going to the middle, you are dissipating half of your energy. So with 2 cycles, you will break. On the other hand, if your hysteresis cycle is smaller, you will being dissipated in each cycle, and then this allows us to predict ultra-low cycle fatigue. Okay? Then let's see if it works or not. I mean, the model needs all these parameters. I've defined the blue parameters. Those are the ones that can be calibrated just with a monotonic analysis of your material or with an hysteresis, with a couple of hysteresis loops. For example, C1 and C2 correspond to the kinematic hardening and unit hysteresis loop. And then you have in red the parameters required by the model in order to simulate this ultra-low cycle fatigue. And one of these parameters is this factor energy or the plastic energy that can be dissipated by your material. Now, we have applied this to two different steels, X52 and X60. Those are pipeline steels because pipelines are, ultra-low cycle fatigue it's a major concern in pipelines. They can be submitted to seismic load, for example, and then they will have some cycles applied to them, and you don't want them to break. So you need models to predict this possible failure. And what we've done is we have calibrated that model, showing it here, that model and all the parameters with one of the tests made on the sample here. Okay, so the blue and green lines correspond to the experimental analysis. The red line corresponds to the numerical model. So it can fit quite well to the experimental data. And we have, with this data, we have calculated all these parameters, and knowing the failure for a given plastic strain, the ultra-low cycle fatigue failure for a given plastic strain, what we've done is we have calculated these two values here. There is no failure for a given plastic strain, is this blue one here. Now, you've got all these green points that correspond to the experimental analysis and the red line that corresponds to the numerical results. And as you can see, the assumption that we've made that this plastic energy that it can be dissipated can drive the low cycle fatigue problem. Well, it's quite accurate because the results are quite accurate. And if we do not apply these results to this specimen here, but we apply the results to what is called the OH sample, that it has a hole in the middle, so it has some stress concentrations. Again, the results that we are obtaining are pretty good. And the material parameters are exactly the same for all these models. Right? So it really works. Now, the idea of approaching ultra-low cycle fatigue problems with a plastic load instead of a cold filtration rule that it's much faster is that we want to apply it and we want to be able to apply a varying load, and we want to be able to apply it to large structures. And that's another example we have solved in the framework of an European project, where you have this pressurized pipe and you are applying this increase on amplitude. You've got, I think it was about 20-something cycles in which the amplitude was increasing, and then it remains with a constant amplitude, the load, until it breaks. Okay, so the failure in the pipe, this is the hysteresis cycle obtained in the pipe. At the beginning, you have small hysteresis loops because you're increasing the amplitude, and then they more or less stabilize in these red lines. And the pipe broke after 44 cycles. Okay, we made the numerical analysis, we made the simulation, just deforming this pipeline several times, and those are the results obtained. The numerical one is the red. In green, you have the experimental one, and our failure was obtained after 42 plastic cycles. So 2 less than the experimental results, which again proves that this formulation works pretty well. Therefore, with the plastic model that it's capable of accounting for the amount of plastic energy that it's being dissipated, I've shown you that it's possible to solve ultra-low cycle fatigue. And the good part of it is that, this model can be applied for ultra-low cycle fatigue or for just a plasticity phenomenon. Or you can apply a plastic load, whatever it is, and then apply some cycles. I mean, because the model, I mean, does not measure the number of cycles, but it just only reads the amount of energy that you're dissipating as the simulation goes on. Now, let's go to high cycle fatigue. And for high cycle fatigue, we do not have plasticity, so we'll have to go to a damage model. And for that, I give the word to Lucia that will continue with this presentation.
Thank you, Javier. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I have to say this is the first official event that we have in the post-COVID era where I can meet you in person. That's not virtual. I mean, I cannot see you only online. But either way, hello to the online assistant. So let's speak a little bit about the high cycle fatigue formulation that we have developed here at FIN, okay? Some generalities about high cycle fatigue. As Karen mentioned, we are dealing with loads that induce inside our material level of stresses below the elastic limit, okay? So we don't have plastic deformation. And in fact, if we don't do something specifically to account for the accumulation of number of cycles, we would be having no nonlinear effect whatsoever inside our constitutive model. We would be launching the simulation, applying a cyclic load during millions of cycles or dozens of millions of cycles, and everything would be in the elastic state, okay? Now, there are some tools that can be used by engineers that are currently used by engineers throughout the whole world, let's say, in different industrial ambits. For instance, in the aeronautical domain, in the automotive domain, etc. And of course, the most famous ones and the easiest to use, I have to admit, are the ones such as Euler curves that Xavi already mentioned, and also the Pagram minor group. I don't know if you've heard about this. It's quite easy and straightforward to use also. This is a law that is mainly used when we have several blocks of cyclic loading, and each different block has a different stress amplitude induced in the material, okay? So this is just a rule to accumulate the damage given by each different block of load, okay? Now, this is simple to use, but it has already been proven that it's not entirely valid for specific cases. And we will see later on some additional or alternative method that I propose in order to solve this issue with damage accumulation due to variable cyclic loading, okay? Okay, now, what do we normally find when we are dealing with high cycle fatigue simulation? The most common models you will see are all related to damage simulation, okay? And there are models that use a damage curve approach. Sometimes there are energy-based damage theories, continuum damage models, of course. And actually, what I will show to you today is also a continuum damage model, which is based on the Euler curve and also on a reduction function for the strength of the material, okay? Now, let's go a little bit in depth about the isotropic damage model that we are using for this fatigue simulation in the case of high cycle fatigue. Basically, it's a very, very simple model, I have to say here. We have a scalar damage parameter which relates this real space where we have the cracks inside our material with the effective space where we account all of these nonlinear phenomena occurring inside the real material. We count for them in a phenomenological way by means of this damage variable. So what happens actually? Well, in the real space, we have cracks in the microstructure of the material with 10 coalescence, and then you will have a macro crack, okay, which will propagate, etc., leading to failure. What happens inside the numerical model is you have an effective space, non-damage, where all of these cracks inside the specific volume of the material are quantified inside the damage parameter. So you will not be seeing specifically the micro cracks, of course, but you will have a level of damage, for instance, of 0.1, which will say that, okay, I've lost 10% of the stiffness of my material inside that volume due to the appearance of damage, okay? Now, the constitutive law that we are using is quite easy also and quite straightforward. We are considering, of course, the change in the stiffness of the material inside the constitutive tensor, the second constitutive tensor. And the evolution of the damage variable depends on this mu parameter, which is very, very similar to the plastic consistency factor that I'm sure you've seen and you've heard about during these 2 days of lecture. Also, I want to speak a bit about the damage threshold criteria, because this is an important part of every nonlinear model, I would say. And basically what we are doing when we are verifying this condition is we are asking the model if we are in the elastic domain or we are in the nonlinear domain. And here we have two different functions. The first term quantifies for us the function of equivalent stress, okay? And this is associated to a specific stress vector, and it quantifies the components of the stress vector, translating them into a scalar value, which will then be compared with the evolution of the threshold function. And here, for instance, you can use very famous criteria, such as von Mises, such as Moore-Coulomb, Tresca, Rankin. I'm sure you've heard of these names for sure. Okay, now, in the damage threshold evolution function, I would say this term over here, what we are doing is we are quantifying how the surface, the nonlinear damage surface, moves. And how does it move? Well, it can admit the different types of behavior. For instance, if you haven't heard about this, you can have softening behavior or hardening behavior in a general way. In damage, always we have softening behavior. And the softening can be, for instance, linear, exponential. There are different mathematical equations that describe the evolution of this function. Okay? Now, everything that I've shown before is what you would get in a standard classic damage model. As I said, quite a simple one. But you would have no effect of fatigue whatsoever. You would be applying the cyclic loading. You would have elastic strains, elastic stresses, millions of cycles. The material would be completely untouched. And we know this is not what happens in reality, okay? So we need to have a mathematical formulation to account this accumulation of number of cycles inside the constitutive model. And I'm doing this by means of this reduction function, this term which is called the F-red reduction function, okay? We are quantifying it inside the constitutive model, inside this damage threshold criterion. And there are basically two alternatives that you can use when you want to quantify it. Well, you can apply it inside this first term over here. So we are dividing the stresses by this function. And what we are actually doing, since the function moves between 0 and 1, starting at 1 and downgrading until 0, what we are doing is we are incrementing the stress state inside our material, okay? And we are amplifying the stresses according to this reduction coefficient until we reach the strength threshold and we begin to have nonlinear effect inside our material. A second option that you can do to take into account fatigue inside this constitutive model is to use it inside this evolution function, let's say, of the threshold. And there what you would be doing is instead of dividing, you would be multiplying with this F-red coefficient. What does this mean? What are you doing actually? Well, what you're doing is you are reducing the strength of the material continuously until you reach the maximum level of strength applied inside your material. And this is when you will begin to have nonlinear effects at that specific material point. Okay? Okay, so I want to maybe stress at this point what this reduction function depends on, because this is important. It depends on the number of cycles that were applied to the material, of course. It depends on this error coefficient, which is the reversion factor of the stress. This is the ratio between the minimum stress and the maximum stress developed at each material point inside your finite element model. And it also depends on what is that maximum level of stress developed during one cycle of loading. Okay? Okay, so I'm stating here that this model is formulated through Wooler curves. So what do I mean with this? How do we connect the Wooler curves with this reduction function? Well, first I want to make like this visual impression of what you'll be seeing when you are using a model such as this inside your finite element simulation. For instance, at one of the most stressed points inside your model, you will be observing an evolution such as this. Actually, you have this curve available at any point inside your model. Any finite element, any integration point of that finite element has this curve available. But for us, the most interesting point, of course, is the one that is the most stressed inside the geometry, right? So what we are doing here, we are applying this active loading, okay? We have this maximum level of the load during one cycle. And based on the Wooler curve, we would know, for instance, with just this analytical instrument, that after applying this nth number of cycles, we will be breaking that material at that specific material point. Okay? But As I said, we are also adding this reduction function of the strength, okay? So what's going on here? This reduction function is defined by means of these 2 points. It must necessarily pass through these 2 points, okay? This is the static strength, okay? At the first level of loading, you're starting with the static strength. And it must obligingly pass through the intersection with the Buller curve also. Basically, because then you would be respecting what the Buller curve says, that you are breaking this material for this level of maximum loading at this level of cyclic loading, or at this fatigue life, let's say. However, the evolution between these 2 points, the one that I'm describing here, for instance, schematically, this is totally dependent on the equations that you are using, the mathematical definition of that reduction function, okay? And in fact, you can have just not a single equation that you can use. There are several proposals. We, of course, will propose one. And you, if you want to investigate during your PhD studies, you can also propose some alternative definitions. Okay, so regarding the actual equations that we are using, here you can see what is the definition for the Buller surface inside our postulative model. So this is what is computed at each integration point inside each finite element, okay? And this is the definition of the reduction factor function. Now, what is important for you to notice here? Of course, there are some material parameters inside these equations, as there are in any fatigue model that you will see out there in the world. And these are alpha, beta F, etc. What is important to notice now is not exactly what these parameters are, but that they are exactly the same in between the Buller function and the residual strength function. What does this mean? What is the relevance of this? It means that when you are calibrating your Buller function expression with some experimental results, as you will have to do when you're running a fatigue simulation, you are automatically defining, okay, what is the expression of the reduction function at each integration point inside your model. This is good because we just fixed set of parameters, you are defining both functions, okay? This is important. Okay, I can get into more details regarding the equations. You can find them inside our papers. It's not something that I want to insist on now. Just take into account that everything is quantified according to the level of stresses. These are the material parameters that I mentioned that we have to calibrate. And I want to show to you how this calibration actually look like, okay, for real cases, for steels that are used inside the industry. Okay. I have 2 different steels here. This is a cast steel characterization. That one is a complex phase 800 steel characterization. These are both of them used in the automotive industry. And what we are basically receiving when we want to run a fatigue simulation are some experimental points, like the one that you see here, okay, SN points for both steels. And when you calibrate those material parameters that I mentioned before, you are actually calibrating the evolution of these 2 curves. They are for different reversion factors. Okay, here you have -1 is the blue one, and the red one is for reversion factor 0.1, which is a ratio which is quite commonly used in the industrial characterization world. But I want you to understand that this is not merely a 2D calibration, okay? I'm just looking at this graph and I'm just seeing 2 curves that I'm calibrating. No, when I'm doing this calibration, what I'm actually doing inside the finite element model is I am defining a surface for these Buller stresses, let's say, which are completely defined for all the range of stress ratios. And this is important. Why? Because I will begin to apply a level of loading inside a geometry that I'm interested in analyzing, and I'm going to have some stresses at the beginning of the simulation, in the first cycle, in the 7th, in the 10th, etc. It doesn't matter. But once I change the load because I'm interested in variable amplitude loading, or maybe I have some damage effects inside our model and I have a crack that has to propagate, so you'll have stress redistribution. What this means is the stresses will change. And that means that possibly the reversion factor is going to change. So if you only define that discretely, this Buller or specific reversion factors, you have the problem undefined in between. And that's not good if you have an undefined problem, okay? So basically, the problem is quantified or is defined in such a way in the finite element simulation that each integration point inside specific finite elements that have to move outside of the stress ratios which were calibrated, they will be defined properly with our model. Okay. Okay, that was said about the Wöhler stresses, but I also mentioned about the reduction function. So how does this look like if you want to quantify in a 3D way the intersection between the reversion function and the Wöhler curve? Basically, for a specific case of a maximum stress of 700 megapascals, you would be having this failure line, I would say, for all the range of stress ratios inside your material, but always with that level of maximum stress, okay? Just so you can have a visual. Okay, now, when I'm doing this model, what am I doing that's so great as compared to what is normally done by engineers in the world today? Why is this model significant? Well, there are a lot of softwares over there, very famous one, all of you know about Abacus and ANSYS that do nonlinear analysis and finite element analysis, and they can be easily coupled with some plugins which solve the fatigue problem. These plugins, I don't know if you've heard about them, but they are very well documented commercially. ENCODE, FESafe, FEMFAT, these are names that you can find inside this world. And what is the normal general practice when you're doing a fatigue simulation is you are setting up the simulation inside ANSYS or Abacus or whatever the finite element code you want to use. You run the first cycle of loading with an elastic simulation if you are in the high cycle fatigue, with the plastic model if you are in ultra low cycle or low cycle fatigue. And you look at what is the maximum level of stress or maximum level of plastic deformation during that first cycle of loading. With that value for the entire geometry, okay, you go inside this plugin which solves fatigue in a commercial way, and it will output for you what is the level, what is the life expected for that component. Of course, it has several coefficients, reduction coefficients, for instance, if you have welding, if you have specific stuff that affect your fatigue behavior. But what I want to stress here is that you would be doing just, or simulating just one cycle of loading, and that you would be using just one value of stress or of plastic strain for the entire geometry. And what we are doing with this formulation, when we are setting up the finite element model, is that we have available values of Wöhler stress reduction function coefficients at each and every finite element inside our model at each and every integration point. And we can follow their evolution during the whole history of the loading. What does this mean? That I won't be applying just one cycle of loading as in the standard case, okay, which is a good case for several applications, but not for all of them. In fact, I would have to apply the entire history of loading, which sometimes, and specifically in the case of high cycle fatigue, we are talking about hundreds of thousands of cycles, sometimes millions of cycles. What does this mean? That I will grow old next to the computer because the simulation will take forever. If I define just one cycle of loading with 20 increments, just imagine the time that I'm going to have to spend there, okay? So that's not good. We want to have a fast solution in order to be able to run this full nonlinear simulation. So what do we need then? Well, we need an algorithm that allows us to speed up a little bit the process and to apply large chunks of blocks of number of cycles when there is nothing happening in our model. When we are in the elastic domain, there is no propagation of crack, there is no nonlinear dissipation inside our model. And how did we do that? Well, we devised a stepwise advancing strategy, which is actually a strategy for us to do these blocks of cycles, these jumps of blocks of cycles. And for instance, if we have a load history, which is comprised of, I don't know, 3 different blocks of cycles with 3 different amplitudes and different diversion factors, what we would be doing when we're using such a strategy in our case is we would be describing the first cycles of each one of the blocks of loading, okay, with small increments, 20 increments, 12 increments, the number that we need in order to have an accurate follow-up of the stresses and strains inside our geometry. And we would be monitoring what is the stability of the stress state inside the finite element model from one cycle to the next. And if it's stable, then I can apply the large number of cycles, okay? If it's not, I have to continue to apply small increments of loading. So when I say that I'm following, let's say, some variables from one cycle to the next, what I'm basically saying is we apply the simulation with small number of cycles, with small increments, for each number of cycles. We monitor what is the maximum stress at each integration point inside each finite element from one cycle to the next, and we're monitoring also what is this ratio between the stresses at each integration point in each finite element. Afterwards, we sum the difference in between one cycle and the next one for all of the points in my geometry, okay? And I compare this to a tolerance. If I am below a given tolerance, then I consider this to be a stable stress state. And I am free to apply large increments of number of cycles. If I'm not below this tolerance, then I'm obliged to continue applying the load, as I said, by small increments. Now, this might seem a little bit pesky for the user that unfortunately has the misfortune of setting up this fatigue simulation, but in fact it's all automatically done, let's say, inside the finite element code. The user can customize this algorithm by setting up a specific step of number of cycles, 1,000 cycles, 50,000 cycles, it depends on the problem, that they want to use for the large-scale algorithm. And how does the simulation run? Well, we are starting with the load tracking stage, I'm going to call it, which is a small increment stage, okay? We are monitoring the stress state inside our solid. We see that everything is stable. We go and we apply large chunks of numbers of cycles. And then we check to see, okay, do we have damage at least one integration point inside our solid? Or did the loads that we were applying change? Do we have a different amplitude now? Do we have a different level of maximum stress, etc.? If we detect this, back to load tracking stage, back to small increments. If everything is stable again, large increments. And this is done automatically until I continue to dissipate all the energy of the material, and I consider that I completely failed my sample. Okay. Now let's take a look at some examples for different types of steel and what I can see, for instance, in a numerical simulation. I will be able to follow the initiation of damage and, most importantly, the propagation of damage throughout the geometry. This is what you cannot do with the commercial solution, okay? Then I will obtain, of course, from the simulation a specific number of cycles at which my sample has completely failed because the damage has propagated throughout the entire cross-section. And if I map, for instance, for this level of maximum stress induced in this material, about 440 megapascal, I map what is the fatigue life obtained from this simulation, and I put it over there on top of the calibration made for this material. And you see there's a small discrepancy between the blue curve and the red dot. And I want to explain a bit what this means, because this is very relevant and it can help you understand some things when you see graphs like this. For instance, this small discrepancy is because, or is due to this factor. When I reach this level of cycles corresponding to this blue dot over there, or to the blue line, let's say, this is when I will begin to have, in my numerical simulation, damage accumulation. Okay, I start to have nonlinear dissipation, damage starts to accumulate. And until it propagates completely, I spend the number of cycles in between these 2 points, okay? Now, why is this relevant? Because it is highly dependent on the material. If I have a very ductile behavior, I'm going to need a lot of cycles to propagate completely the damage, okay? Because I have a lot of energy to dissipate. So this point is going to go quite further away, okay? If I have a very brittle behavior, I have less energy available, then I will propagate very fast. And this point will be quite close to the blue line over there, okay? So for you, it's an idea when you see results from simulation compared to the SN curve and stuff like that, you can notice if you are dealing with ductile behavior or fragile behavior when you're looking at this difference, let's say. Okay, I want to show some more examples for other steels. For instance, this is a UC bore steel which is used in the automotive industry, and here you can see the size or the shape of the sample we've used in the finite element model. This is a standard laboratory small-scale samples, okay? And we set up the simulation to hold one end of the sample, and we apply cyclic loading on the other end, okay? And we run several different amplitudes of the loading. And I want to show you, for instance, how the simulation works and what you can see over there. Also, you can see the points that we obtained experimentally compared to the points that we obtained numerically, and sorry, the points we obtained numerically compared with the experimental points in the calibration that we made. Also, quite fragile behavior here, you can see. Some other case for another steel. This steel is a cast steel, which is also used in the automotive industry. The shape of the specimen is a bit different in this case. Again, we're running the finite element simulation. We can look at the damage propagation, initiation and posterior propagation until complete failure. The fatigue life in this case is a bit smaller, just 40,000 cycles. And if I want to see, okay, I've seen some schematic curves, but what would I actually be seeing inside the finite element simulation when I run fatigue simulations such as this? Basically, at the most stress point, for instance, you would have this curve I stress at each point in your simulation. But of course, we are looking at the most stress one because it's the one that has the most meaningful information. Okay. So basically, I've been seeing the level of stress applied. Here, I was in a small increment state. Afterwards, I applied large chunks until nearly reaching the end of the elastic zone. And when I reached the intersection with the Buller curve and with the reduction function, this is when I started to accumulate damage. And because I have a very brittle behavior, not a lot of energy available, I accumulated damage very, very, very fast in just some cycles. Okay. So just an idea of what I would be seeing inside the finite element simulation. Okay, now what is the advantage, or where do I want to go when I'm using this type of fatigue numerical models? Yes.
5 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to go quite fast. Then the idea is to use this type of simulations to reproduce correctly the load sequence when you have different blocks of cyclic loading with different characteristics. Okay, why? Because if you use the minor law, as I said, you are not going to predict correctly. The minor law, just assume you start with the highest amplitude and then you go slow, applying the blocks of loading, decreasing the amplitude of the load. And if you invert or if you change that order of loading, it's known that the minor rule does not proceed the damage accumulation correctly. So in order to detect this or demonstrate the capabilities of the formulation to predict the load sequence, we've done some experiments together with some colleagues that we have at EURECAT, which is another Catalan research center. The shape of the specimens are the ones that you can see here. And what we focused on in this experimental campaign was to see if we were able to reproduce with the residual strength function, what was the effect of having applied a determined number of cycles. For instance, 40,000 cycles. I apply it on a material, and then I stop. I don't break the sample, but I imagine, or I would like to imagine, that I'm actually changing the material parameters. There was some change in the stiffness or in the strength due to having applied this number of cycles. And in fact, this was proved experimentally by them. They made several tests where they applied between 41 and 45,000 cycles, and then they broke the sample monotonically. Okay? And the idea was to check if the failure of the sample occurred as in the monotonic case, for the ultimate tensile strength, or if in fact it occurred at a lower level of maximum stress, which was actually what we expected. In fact, it occurred, yes, at a somewhat lower level, and then we set up the same numerical simulation as them. And we wanted to see if our model was able to predict with the calibration that we had done this effect. And the good news is that it was, in fact, able. We obtained a level of maximum stress in the numerical simulation of about 863 megapascals, which was very coherent with what they observed experimentally. Okay, just very, very fast. I want to explain plastic damage.
I suggest you to skip this part.
Yeah.
And just go to the
Okay.
Because otherwise,
Okay.
if they're interested, next course,
Yeah.
will explain.
These are some weird, funky equations. Okay. Okay, I understand the need for coffee. Okay, after listening to us for 2 hours, this is a model that we've just developed. You can see it adjusts well to the experiment. You can follow our publications and you will learn more about this. Okay, but I want to explain now how we are applying the more well-developed models. I would say all the oldest models that we've developed inside research projects. Okay. And I want to speak specifically about 2 different projects. No problem. Okay. No problem. Just to speak about Fatigue for Light. This is a European project which deals with lightening chassis components, okay, for electric vehicles. And it's a European project. It lasts 3 years. The funding is, well, you can find details online. in the web page for the project. No need for this. We have a lot of industrial partners, so this proves that the industry is interested in these types of models, okay? And what are we doing exactly in the Fatigue for Light project? Basically, we want to reduce the chassis weight by formulating new advanced numerical simulation tools, which are based on the models that I've shown here, and some fast testing methodologies for fatigue. Because just to let you know, fatigue testing experimentally takes a long time, okay? So keep it in mind. And how do we want to lighten the chassis components in the project? We have several different avenues, of course. First, we are thinking about using more performant materials, high-strength steel, aluminum alloy, press hardening steel, etc. Depends on the application. Then, of course, we want to have a simulation of part performance with simulating the manufacturing process of that component, which induces residual stresses and stuff that will completely screw the fatigue behavior and performance afterwards, just to let you know. Then part monitoring, advanced testing, as I said, fast fatigue methodologies, and the sustainability approach, which is very important nowadays, designing from an eco-design perspective. Okay. The materials that we propose to use in the project, I won't go in there. You can go in the webpage and you'll find out, or you can ask me and I happily explain. And the idea, how do we want to apply the high cycle fatigue model that I've shown you before in the project? Well, we'll use it for small and large scale samples. We want to verify the residual strength functions for different materials, because different material characterization will have different evolutions for that function, okay? And we want to validate it experimentally, of course. Demonstrate the load sequence effect. Either way, just set up large fatigue simulations for chassis components, okay? Okay, now we have another project in the group. We're also very happy to have it, FiberG. You can also find out more details from the web of the project. It's a large consortium. It deals with wind turbines, okay? So it's in the wind industry. And here we are using the models that I've shown. We are using them inside the framework for a composite analysis, because the project deals with composite materials, which are the wind blades are made of these composite materials. We want to simulate them, and we want to assess their fatigue performance by using these models that I've shown before at constituent level. So we use it for the fiber, we use it for the matrix. We can even use it for the whole lamina if we propose, and then analyze the stacking behavior for the composite using some other theories such as the roller mixtures, for instance. Okay, that's it. Suggested lectures, you will find it in the presentation. Also ask me if you have any doubt and you need help. And thank you very much for your patience today.